The roar of a dozen motorcycles shattered the stillness of the quiet suburban street. Their headlights cut through the thickening dusk, illuminating the tense faces of a crowd that had gathered outside a local diner. Whispers of unease rippled through the spectators, though no one dared speak too loudly. In the middle of it all, a lone black Harley pulled up last, its engine growling like a predator. The rider dismounted with calm precision, her dark leather jacket catching the faint glimmer of streetlights, the patched sewn onto her back. A skull encircled by flames left no doubt about who she was or the message she carried. Hours earlier, things couldn't have been more different. Jada Thompson had been on her way home after a long shift at the shelter where she worked, her mind preoccupied with nothing more than dinner plans and a warm bath. Her kind smile and easy laugh were well known in the community, but to Officer Harris, none of that mattered. To him, Jada was just another target. The encounter began innocuously enough. A routine traffic stop, or so Jada had thought. But when she pulled over and rolled down her window, the officer's tone was immediately sharp, his words laced with condescension. "License and registration," he barked, barely glancing at her as he adjusted the belt, holding his taser and baton. Jada complied without hesitation, her hands steady but her heart racing. She'd heard stories of situations like this, stories that never seemed to end well. As Harris inspected her documents, his demeanor shifted from indifferent to accusatory. "This vehicle looks a little too nice for someone like you," he sneered. The insinuation wasn't subtle, and Jada felt a familiar wave of anger rise within her. Still, she remained calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked evenly, her voice betraying none of the fear she felt. That was when everything spiraled. Claiming she was being uncooperative, Harris demanded that Jada step out of the car. When she hesitated, asking for clarification, he yanked the door open and dragged her out with force that was both unnecessary and alarming. The crowd that had begun to gather watched in horror as Jada was shoved to the ground, her cries of protest drowned out by the officer's harsh commands. What Harris didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was who Jada really was. She wasn't just a social worker trying to make ends meet. She wasn't just another person he could intimidate and silence. Jada was family, and her family didn't take kindly to injustice. By the time Harris had cuffed her and hauled her to his patrol car, word had already spread. Texts and calls flew faster than wildfire through the underground network that Jada's older brother Marcus had built. Marcus wasn't just any biker. He was the leader of the Iron Brotherhood, a diverse but fiercely loyal group of riders who prided themselves on protecting their own. So, as Jada sat in the cold, sterile holding cell of the precinct, bruised but not broken, Marcus and the Brotherhood were already mounting their response. They weren't just angry, they were strategic. "This isn't just about Jada," Marcus growled to his crew, his voice filled with conviction. "This is about making sure they know they can't treat us like this anymore." Now, as the row of motorcycles lined the street outside the diner, the crowd held their breath. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the anticipation of what was to come. Harris, who was inside enjoying a late dinner as if nothing had happened, was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing outside. Jada's voice echoed in Marcus's mind as he took a step forward. "Do this right, Marcus," she had said before he left to organize the group. "Not for revenge, for justice." Marcus nodded to himself, his resolve unshakable. The Brotherhood wasn't just here to make noise. They were here to make a statement. But what would happen next would shake the entire town, and leave Harris facing the consequences of his actions in a way he never saw coming. And just as the diner's doors swung open, the screen fades to black. What happens next? Stay tuned. The diner's bright fluorescent lights spilled onto the pavement, casting an almost surreal glow on the street as Marcus and the Iron Brotherhood stood in formation. The muted hum of their idling bikes added an edge to the silence, their presence a silent warning to anyone who dared intervene. People inside the diner pressed themselves against the windows, peering out with a mix of curiosity and fear. Among them was Officer Harris, his face momentarily frozen in confusion before it hardened into something colder, something meaner. Harris didn't move at first. He sat back in his booth, chewing the last bite of his burger like nothing could touch him. That's the thing about people like Harris. They wear their power like armor, believing it shields them from any consequence. But tonight was different, and even he was beginning to sense it. Marcus stepped closer to the diner, his boots crunching against the gravel, each step deliberate. The streetlights caught the heavy chain looped across his shoulder, a piece of his bike, but a symbol of strength to anyone who knew him. The rest of the Brotherhood followed, each member radiating an unspoken promise of solidarity. Inside, Harris shifted in his seat, glancing toward the exit as if calculating his next move. He wasn't afraid, at least not yet. But there was something about the unwavering confidence of the bikers that unsettled him. The Iron Brotherhood wasn't the kind of group to pick fights or cause trouble without reason. Their reputation had been built on loyalty and justice, not chaos. But when pushed, they pushed back. Jada wasn't just Marcus' little sister. She was family to everyone in the Brotherhood. Her years of tireless work in the community had earned her respect far beyond their circle. She had taken in kids with nowhere to go, fed families who couldn't make ends meet, and stood up to injustice, even when it came at a cost. And now she was sitting in a jail cell because of a man who saw her skin color as a threat. Marcus clenched his jaw, remembering the bruises on Jada's wrists when he visited her at the precinct. She had tried to act tough, downplaying the pain, but he saw through it. He had seen the exhaustion in her eyes, the frustration of knowing she had done nothing wrong and yet was treated like a criminal. The Brotherhood had spent the last few hours gathering details, piecing together what had happened from witnesses who had been at the scene. One of them, a young girl named Tasha, had recorded the entire altercation on her phone. The video showed Harris slamming Jada against the car, his grip tight enough to leave marks. Her voice, calm but firm, repeatedly asked why she was being detained. Harris's response, "Because I said so." The video had spread quickly, igniting outrage among the local community. Marcus knew they had the evidence to expose Harris. But this wasn't just about the video. This was about making a stand, about showing that people like Harris couldn't abuse their power without accountability. Back inside the diner, Harris finally rose from his seat, his eyes narrowing as he walked toward the door. The crowd inside parted nervously, whispering among themselves. Harris adjusted his belt, the weight of his badge, and gunned a clear statement. He pushed open the door, stepping outside and letting it slam shut behind him. The tension crackled in the air like an impending storm. Harris looked at Marcus, then at the group of bikers standing behind him. "What do you think you're doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto Harris with an intensity that could make anyone uneasy. "We're here to talk," he said simply, his tone calm but firm. "Talk." Harris scoffed, glancing around as if expecting someone to come to his defense. "You think showing up with your little gang is going to scare me?" "This isn't about scaring anyone," Marcus replied. "This is about accountability." Harris chuckled, shaking his head as if the entire situation was a joke. "Accountability. Don't make me laugh. Your sister broke the law, and now she's facing the consequences. That's how the system works." Marcus took a step closer, his expression hardening. "The system doesn't work when people like you abuse it. We've seen the video. We know what you did." The crowd that had gathered outside grew larger, their murmurs growing louder. People were pulling out their phones, recording every word, every gesture. Harris glanced around, the weight of so many eyes beginning to press on him. "Video or not," she resisted, he said defensively. "I was doing my job." "Your job?" Marcus's voice rose slightly, enough to cut through the murmurs. "Your job is to protect and serve, not harass and assault innocent people." Jada didn't resist. She asked you why she was being pulled over, and you couldn't even give her an answer. Instead, you decided to show your power by slamming her to the ground. Harris opened his mouth to retort, but the sound of revving engines cut him off. The bikers behind Marcus revved their bikes in unison, the roar echoing down the street. It wasn't just noise, It was a warning. "I don't have to explain myself to you," Harris said finally, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "If you've got a problem, take it up with the department." "We will," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But tonight, we're here to make sure you understand that we won't stay silent. Not anymore." The crowd around them erupted into cheers and applause, the energy shifting as people realized they were witnessing something bigger than a confrontation. This was a stand against injustice, a fight for dignity and respect. Harris took a step back, the first sign of uncertainty flashing across his face. He hadn't expected this, a united front, a community rallying behind someone he had dismissed as unimportant. For the first time, he began to feel the weight of his actions, the reality that his badge might not protect him from the truth. Marcus didn't move, his gaze never leaving Harris. The Brotherhood stood behind him like a wall, their presence a reminder that this wasn't over. Not tonight, and not until justice was served. As the night stretched on, the tension remained thick, each moment charged with the possibility of escalation. But Marcus wasn't here for a fight. Not yet. He was here to send a message, one that Harris and everyone watching wouldn't forget. And as the camera panned over the scene, the sounds of engines rumbling and voices rising in unison, the story paused once more, leaving the audience on the edge of their seats, wondering what would happen next. The air outside the diner felt heavy, the kind of weight that came from unspoken words and unresolved tension. Harris shifted his stance, his eyes darting from Marcus to the crowd growing behind him. He could feel the pressure building, not just from the bikers, but from the onlookers who were no longer just watching passively. Phones were still out, cameras rolling, capturing every detail of the confrontation. This wasn't going to fade into obscurity. Marcus stood his ground, unshaken by Harris' attempt at intimidation. The Brotherhood behind him remained silent but resolute, their presence alone a statement of solidarity. Marcus didn't need to shout or posture. His quiet determination spoke volumes. He wasn't here to trade insults or throw punches. He was here to make Harris face something he'd likely avoided his entire career: accountability. Inside the crowd, a young man named Caleb watched with clenched fists. He'd seen the video of Jada's arrest earlier that day, and it brought back memories he'd tried to bury. 2 years ago, Caleb had been stopped by Harris in almost the exact same way. Back then, he'd been walking home from basketball practice, wearing a hoodie that Harris had decided made him suspicious. The encounter had ended with Caleb on the ground, face pressed into the pavement, accused of resisting even though he hadn't done anything wrong. His bruises had healed, but the humiliation and fear still lingered. Caleb took a step forward, his voice trembling but strong. "He's done this before," he called out, addressing the crowd. Heads turned toward him, and even Marcus glanced in his direction. "That cop. He pulled me over 2 years ago for no reason, slammed me to the ground just like he did to Jada. And guess what? Nothing happened. They let him off, say it was my word against his." The crowd murmured in agreement, others chiming in with similar stories. Harris's jaw tightened, his bravado slipping for a fraction of a second. This wasn't just about Jada anymore. It was about a pattern of abuse that people were no longer willing to ignore. Inside the precinct, Jada sat in her cell, her thoughts racing. She had seen Marcus' resolve before, but this was different. He wasn't just fighting for her. He was standing up for something bigger. She worried about what might happen, knowing how quickly things could spiral out of control when emotions ran high. Across from her, another woman sat in silence, her face shadowed by the dim lighting of the holding area. She introduced herself as Maria, arrested earlier that day for what she called a made-up charge. Maria's eyes were sharp, her words cutting as she told Jada about the precinct's reputation. "They protect their own here," Maria said bitterly. "Doesn't matter what you've got, video, witnesses, the truth. They'll bury it if they have to." Jada frowned, but didn't respond. She didn't want to believe that the system was so broken, but Maria's words hit too close to home. She thought about the video, the crowd outside the diner, Marcus, and the Brotherhood. Could they really make a difference, or would it all be swept under the rug like so many other stories? Meanwhile, Inside the diner, Harris's partner, Officer Ramirez, sat quietly in a corner booth, observing the scene through the window. Ramirez had been on the force for less than a year, and he'd already seen enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about law enforcement. He had been there during Jada's arrest, standing a few feet away as Harris escalated the situation. He hadn't said a word, hadn't stepped in, and the guilt gnawed at him now. Ramirez's mind replayed the events over and over. He remembered the look in Jada's eyes, fear mixed with defiance, as she asked Harris why she was being detained. He remembered the way Harris had grabbed her, the unnecessary force he used, and how the crowd had started to gather. Ramirez had frozen, unsure of what to do, afraid of the consequences if he spoke up. Now, watching from the safety of the diner, he felt that same fear creeping back in. But there was something different about this moment. The bikers, the crowd, Marcus. All of it felt like a reckoning, a shift in power that Ramirez couldn't ignore. He glanced at his phone, debating whether to call his superior or stay out of it altogether. Outside, the standoff continued. Marcus took another step forward, his voice steady but firm. "You think you're untouchable, Harris. You think that badge gives you the right to treat people like they're nothing." Harris sneered, but the confidence in his stance was fading. "You don't know anything about what it's like out here. The decisions we have to make." "Decisions?" Marcus countered, his tone sharp. "You call what you did to Jada a decision. Dragging her out of her car, slamming her to the ground. That wasn't a decision. That was a choice to abuse your power." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in support of Marcus. Harris looked around, his bravado crumbling as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. For the first time, he seemed to realize that he wasn't in control anymore. Back in the precinct, Jada heard the faint sound of cheering through the small, barred window in her cell. She closed her eyes, letting the noise wash over her like a wave of hope. Marcus was out there, fighting for her, for all of them. Whatever happened next, she knew she wasn't alone. But the night was far from over, and the tension was still building. Harris wasn't the kind of man to back down easily, and the system he represented wasn't one that changed overnight. As the Brotherhood and the crowd stood their ground, and as Ramirez wrestled with his conscience inside the diner, the story continued to unfold, each moment adding another layer to the fight for justice. The stakes were rising, and everyone, Marcus, Jada, Harris, Ramirez, and the crowd, was about to find out just how much they were willing to risk for what they believed in. The street outside the diner had become a scene of raw tension. The growing crowd buzzed with energy, their voices blending into a hum of anticipation and anger. The Iron Brotherhood stood firm, their presence like a fortress around Marcus, who hadn't taken his eyes off Harris. Every second felt stretched, the silence between their words more powerful than anything that had been said so far. Harris's hand lingered near his belt, brushing against his radio as if debating whether to call for backup. But he hesitated. Calling reinforcements would mean admitting he'd lost control of the situation, that he needed help. It wasn't in his nature to back down, even when he knew he was outmatched. Inside the diner, Ramirez was still glued to his seat, his hand gripping his coffee cup so tightly it threatened to crack. He glanced at Harris, then at Marcus, then back at his phone. His thumb hovered over the call button for his supervisor, but he still didn't press it. Ramirez felt trapped, pulled in two directions. If he stayed silent, he'd be complicit again. If he spoke up, he'd be risking his career and everything he thought he knew about loyalty on the force. On the far edge of the crowd, Caleb was pacing, his energy barely contained. Every time he looked at Harris, his frustration flared. The memory of his own run-in with the officer was a fire that wouldn't go out. He wanted to confront Harris directly, to force him to admit what he'd done to him, to Jada, and to so many others. But every time Caleb took a step forward, Marcus's calm, deliberate stance pulled him back. Marcus turned slightly, catching Caleb's eye. With a subtle shake of his head, Marcus sent a clear message. Not yet. It wasn't time to escalate. This wasn't about losing control. It was about holding their ground, forcing Harris to confront the weight of his actions in a way he couldn't ignore or dismiss. Then, from somewhere deep in the crowd, a voice called out, "Where's the chief? Why isn't anyone holding him accountable?" The question rippled through the crowd, sparking murmurs of agreement. People began shouting similar demands, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were becoming part of the confrontation, their collective anger fueling the moment. Harris's face tightened, the weight of the scrutiny finally starting to crack his facade. He opened his mouth to say something, but Marcus cut him off, his voice carrying over the noise. "You can feel it, can't you?" Marcus said, stepping closer. "That shift, that moment when you realize people aren't afraid of you anymore." Harris glared at him, but the words hit their mark. Marcus wasn't just talking to Harris. He was addressing everyone. Every officer who had ever abused their power, every bystander who had looked the other way, every person who had been told to stay silent. The roar of an approaching engine suddenly cut through the noise, drawing all eyes toward the street. A single motorcycle sped toward the scene, its rider clad in the same leather jacket that marked the Iron Brotherhood. As the bike slowed to a stop, the rider removed their helmet, revealing a woman with sharp features and an air of authority. It was Sam, the Brotherhood's second in command, and one of Marcus's closest allies. She swung her leg off the bike and approached Marcus, her expression unreadable. Leaning in, she whispered something in his ear, her voice too low for anyone else to hear. Marcus nodded, his face tightening with resolve. Sam turned to the crowd, raising her hands to quiet them. Her voice, calm but commanding, cut through the chaos. "We're not here to cause trouble," she said. "We're here for justice. For Jada, for Caleb, for everyone who's been wronged and ignored. This isn't about violence. It's about making sure people like Harris don't get to hide behind their badges anymore." The crowd quieted, her words striking a chord. Even Caleb, who had been moments away from losing his temper, paused to listen. Sam's presence brought a sense of order to the scene, a reminder that the Brotherhood wasn't just a group of bikers. They were a force to be reckoned with, united by a shared purpose. Harris, however, wasn't backing down. He took a step forward, his voice laced with disdain. "You think this changes anything? You think you can just show up and lecture me in the middle of the street?" "No," Marcus replied, his tone measured. "But we can show everyone who you really are." As if on cue, Caleb raised his phone, a screen playing the video of Jada's arrest. The crowd erupted again, their anger reignited by the sight of Harris' actions. More phones went up, the video spreading through the crowd like wildfire. People began chanting Jada's name, their voices a powerful chorus that filled the night air. Harris's face turned red, his composure slipping further with every second. He reached for his radio, his voice sharp as he called for backup. "This is Officer Harris, requesting immediate assistance at the corner of 5th and Main." Situation escalating. The Brotherhood didn't move, their stance unyielding even as Harris's words crackled through the radio. Marcus glanced at Sam, who gave him a subtle nod. They had anticipated this, prepared for it. The Brotherhood wasn't just standing up for Jada, they were standing up for every person who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. In the distance, the sound of sirens began to grow louder, the flashing lights of police cars painting the street in shades of red and blue. The crowd tensed, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Ramirez stood from his booth inside the diner, his heart pounding as he watched the scene unfold. The moment was reaching its breaking point, every piece of the story converging on this one night, this one confrontation. The crowd, the Brotherhood, Marcus, Harris. They were all caught in the tension, the uncertainty of what would happen next. As the first police car pulled up, its lights casting harsh shadows on the faces of the crowd, Marcus took a deep breath. The fight for justice wasn't over, but the next chapter was about to begin. The flashing blue and red lights bathed the street, their rhythmic pulse casting eerie shadows over the tense crowd. 2 squad cars screeched to a stop, and officers began to step out, their faces set in unreadable masks. The hum of voices faltered as the crowd turned its collective attention to the newcomers. For a moment, it seemed as if the world itself had paused, everyone holding their breath to see what would happen next. Marcus remained still, his stance unwavering even as the officers approached. The Brotherhood didn't flinch either, their solidarity like a wall between the Crown and Harris. Sam adjusted her gloves, her gaze scanning the officers for any sign of intent. The group wasn't here to provoke, but they weren't about to back down either. The lead officer, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a graying mustache, stepped forward. His badge identified him as Lieutenant Baker. He glanced at Marcus, then at Harris, who had positioned himself closer to the squad cars, visibly relieved by their arrival. Baker's expression was hard to read, but his tone was clear. He wasn't here for theatrics. "What's going on here?" Baker asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Before Marcus could respond, Harris jumped in, his words rushed and defensive. "These people are obstructing justice, creating a public disturbance. I was forced to call for backup." Baker raised a hand, silencing him. His sharp gaze flickered to Marcus. "You've got a lot of people here, and things look pretty tense. What's the story?" Marcus met Baker's eyes, his voice calm but firm. "The story is your officer over there abused his power. We've got the video, and we've got witnesses. This isn't a disturbance. It's a community standing up for what's right." Baker's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he looked over at Harris. "Video?" he asked, his tone low but pointed. Caleb stepped forward, holding his phone out. "It's all right here. Everything he did to Jada, and the way he treated me 2 years ago." His voice wavered slightly, but carried the weight of his frustration. Baker hesitated, his jaw tightening. He reached for the phone, his posture tense as he began to watch. The crowd leaned in, the air thick with anticipation. Even the other officers seemed to be holding back, waiting to see their lieutenant's reaction. As the video played, Baker's face remained impassive, but the tension in his shoulders was impossible to miss. The faint sound of Jada's voice, calm yet insistent, carried over the street, followed by the unmistakable image of Harris slamming her against the car. The crowd shifted uneasily, their anger simmering beneath the surface. Harris stepped forward, his voice laced with desperation. "Lieutenant, you know how it is. Situations escalate." She was resisting. She wasn't resisting, Baker interrupted sharply, his eyes never leaving the screen. His tone was colder now, more measured. He handed the phone back to Caleb, then turned to Harris. "You didn't report this incident as a use of force. Why not?" Harris faltered, his face reddening. "I didn't think it was necessary. She was being uncooperative. I handled it." Baker's gaze was piercing, his silence more damning than any words. The crowd began murmuring again, their confidence growing as they sensed the shift. Harris was no longer untouchable. The cracks in his armor were beginning to show. But just as the crowd's hopes started to build, the sound of another engine roared down the street. Everyone turned to see a sleek black SUV pulling up, its windows tinted. It came to a halt, and the door opened to reveal a tall, impeccably dressed man stepping out. The man adjusted his tie, his movements deliberate as he surveyed the scene. His presence exuded authority, and the way the officers straightened at the sight of him made it clear he wasn't just anyone. It was Chief Rawlins, the head of the precinct, and Harris's direct superior. The crowd fell into a tense silence as Rawlins approached, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He stopped between Baker and Harris, his sharp eyes taking the scene. "Someone want to tell me what's going on here?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady. "Your officer Harris assaulted my sister Jada. We have the video, and we have witnesses. We're here to make sure this doesn't get buried." Rawlins glanced at Harris, his expression unreadable. "That true, Harris?" Harris hesitated, his confidence slipping further. "It's not what they're making it out to be. She was resisting, and I—" "Enough," Rawlins said, cutting him off. He turned to Baker. "Let me see the video." Baker handed him the phone, and the crowd watched as the chief's face hardened with every passing second. When the video ended, he returned the phone to Caleb without a word. His silence hung heavy in the air, everyone waiting for his response. Then, to everyone's shock, Rollins turned to Marcus. "We'll investigate this," he said, his tone formal. "But you need to clear this crowd. This isn't the way to handle things." The crowd erupted, their voices rising in disbelief and anger. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. "With all due respect, Chief, we've seen investigations like this go nowhere. How do we know you won't just sweep this under the rug?" Rollins' eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning the integrity of this department?" "I'm questioning the integrity of people who protect officers like Harris," Marcus shot back. For a moment, it seemed like everything would spiral out of control. The crowd pressed forward, their frustration boiling over. The Brotherhood stood firm, their presence a reminder that this wasn't just about one person, it was about a system. And then, from the back of the crowd, a new voice rang out. "Check the precinct records," Maria called, stepping forward. "Harris has been doing this for years. There's a trail. You just haven't been looking for it." Her words hit like a thunderclap, the tension rising to a fever pitch. Rollins' face darkened, his composure slipping for the first time. The stakes had just been raised, and the truth was no longer something he could ignore. The silence that followed Maria's words was deafening. The crowd, officers, and even the Brotherhood turned to her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Maria's defiance didn't waver. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Go ahead, Chief. Pull the records. I've been in that precinct. I've seen the reports they don't think anyone reads. Harris has a history, and you know it." Rollins' jaw tightened, and for the first time, doubt flickered across his face. He glanced at Baker, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the Chief's gaze. "Lieutenant," Rollins said, his voice low and commanding, "go back to the precinct and pull every report tied to Officer Harris. I want it all." Baker hesitated, his eyes darting toward Harris, who looked as though he might explode. Now Rollins barked, and Baker nodded, heading quickly to his car. The crowd erupted into murmurs of approval, their faith momentarily buoyed by Rollins' decisive action. But Marcus wasn't ready to celebrate yet. He knew better than to trust that the system would suddenly work in their favor. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, Baker began sifting through the files, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened the system. As he typed Harris's badge number into the database, his heart sank. Maria wasn't exaggerating. There were dozens of complaints against Harris, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling. Most of them had been marked unfounded or closed due to lack of evidence, but the pattern was undeniable. As the reports printed out one by one, Baker's mind raced. He'd always suspected Harris had a dark side, but seeing it laid out so plainly was something else entirely. He gathered the documents and headed back to the scene, his pulse pounding as he considered the implications. Back on the street, tension was still thick in the air. The Brotherhood remained steadfast, their presence a reminder of the power of unity. Sam leaned toward Marcus, her voice low. "You think they'll actually do something with this?" Marcus shook his head, his expression grim. "We'll see, but we're not leaving until they do." Baker's car pulled up moments later, and the lieutenant stepped out, a thick stack of papers in his hands. He approached Rollins, handing him the files without a word. The chief began to flip through them, his face darkening with each page. Harris stood frozen, his bravado completely gone now. "This," Rollins muttered under his breath, his tone a mix of disbelief and anger. He snapped the file shut and turned to Harris. "You didn't disclose half of this during your reviews. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Harris's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. The crowd watched intently, their anticipation growing with each passing second. Then Rollins turned back to Marcus. "You were right. This is bigger than just one incident. Harris, you're suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. And if this pans out the way I think it will, you won't be wearing that badge much longer." The crowd exploded into cheers, their collective relief palpable. Caleb grinned, his fist pumping in the air, and even Jada, who had just been released from her cell at the precinct, joined in the celebration as she made her way toward Marcus. But as the cheers swelled, something in Roland's expression remained guarded. He turned back to the Brotherhood, his tone still measured. This doesn't end here. It's going to take time to unravel all of this, and we'll need to look at everyone's role, not just Harris. Before Marcus could respond, Maria stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the cheers. What about the rest of them? Harris didn't act alone, and you know it. He had backup, people who looked the other way or covered for him. Are you going to investigate them too? Rollins hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. The crowd began murmuring again, their faith in the system wavering. Marcus nodded at Maria, his expression sullen. She's right. This is just the start. We're not going anywhere until we know this isn't just another show. And then, from the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. It was Ramirez. His face was pale, but his steps were steady as he approached the group. He stopped just in front of Rollins, his voice shaky but resolute. Chief, Harris isn't the only one. I've seen things. I stayed silent, but I can't anymore. The crowd gasped, their attention snapping to the young officer. Even Marcus looked surprised, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ramirez. Go on, Rollins said, his tone more curious than accusatory. Ramirez swallowed hard, his gaze flickering to Harris before settling on Rollins. There are others, officers who follow his lead, who cover for him. I didn't know how to speak up, but now I can't stay quiet. The crowd erupted again, this time with mixed emotions, hope, disbelief, and a renewed determination to see justice served. Rollins's face was unreadable as he nodded slowly. Then we'll talk. But this is far from over. As the night wore on and the crowd began to disperse, their energy spent but their spirits lifted. Marcus watched them go, his arm around Jada's shoulders. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like they'd won a battle. But as Marcus turned to leave, a voice stopped him. Marcus, Rollins called, his tone unusually soft. This isn't going to be easy. You ready for what comes next? Marcus turned back, his expression steady. We've been ready for years. It's the system that's just catching up. Rollins nodded, a flicker of respect crossing his face. As the Brotherhood mounted their bikes and rolled off into the night, the echoes of their engines carried a message. The fight for justice wasn't over, but the tide was finally turning.